Hi, I'm Greg. Welcome to Affect Studio, and welcome to part 3 of my investigation into Kemper's new liquid profiling. I want to put it through its paces and test the accuracy of liquid profiling. Can you really get the same sound you needed specific profiles for from the one profile? Listening to my last video, the clean sounded perfect, and I liked the EQ, but I wasn't so sure about the slightly distorted settings. As always with these tests, I'm not using any effects, so we're only hearing the raw amp sound, which is what we're trying to judge. I was unsure about the lower gain drive sounds on the Plexi style head into the quad box using an existing profile, so I've made new profiles of it. I didn't put quite as much time into the mic setup as I normally do, as I'm just wanting to test the accuracy. We already know that Kemper can profile the amps. I made a full volume liquid profile with the cab, followed by a direct only liquid profile, so I can test merge profiles. I then made a generic profile with the amp set with a volume on 1.5, treble on 8, mids on 3, bass on 6 and presence on 7. My apologies for the ugly tone, but I'm pushing the EQ so it's actually doing something for a more informative test. I then set the liquid profiled versions to the same settings I had the low gain profile on. First thing I noticed was that there was more drive with the liquid profiled volume set the same as the original amp. So I used a generic gain value to match the amount of drive. So here they are. So this is a liquid profile of the amp before I've done anything to it. So I can confirm that sounds almost exactly the same as the amp did when I was doing the refining process. The amp and the profile sound identical. So this is a generic profile made with the amp turned down. And this is a liquid profile matching the settings. Then this here is the merged profile from the full liquid profile. So there is a very slight difference between them, but only hearing it side by side like this. Basically, it's captured the amp the same way, turning it down from the full volume profile to the generic one. Now I've got to say that there's a bit of an ugly sound in the high frequencies there. Around there, which the original amp didn't have on the lower gain profile. It's probably exacerbated by having a mids cut and the treble and presence up, but I have noticed that before when profiling some amps. It's not on the original amp. So with that in mind, it's interesting to note that the three profiles sound pretty much identical at the lower gain settings, and they have that same sort of harshness and cloudy high frequencies that the generic one had. So definitely liquid profiling is working and producing the same sound as the amp turned down for this test. It's worth noting that when I first turned down the gain on the liquid profile, it sounded terrible. I quickly realised I needed to turn down the bright cap setting in the amp menu that you can only access from the profiler itself. I initially thought the merge profile was way off too until I remembered the bright cap again. So it's something you keep in mind. Not all of us like the sound of a bright cap, and not all of us have them actually in the amp. Now the process of making a liquid profile is basically exactly the same as before. There are basically 2 extra controls now. So you've got your gain pot reference, which if you're doing the full profile, they say to put on 10, so you put that on 10, and that doesn't actually change anything, I don't think, except tell them what you've set it on. Now, of course, you can still profile, at a lower volume level, so if you're doing that on, say, 3, you could set that so it's the reference for them. And then you've got your generic model, if you want to just do a generic profile, or you can select one of theirs, and you've got the whole list of, different amps you can choose. Now, depending on which model you've chosen will depend on how many controls you get on the next page, and also what value they're set to, because some amps go from 0 to 10, others go from 1 to 10, and so some of them will default to 5.5, others will default to 5, and I think the Tweed ones actually will go to 6.5 because Tweed amps go to 12. So your EQ position control is now blacked out. You can't change that. That's all set as part of the model. You then set your return level, which is always the trickiest part. A bit of trial and error to get that right. They really need a good meter on these so to make it easier and more accurate. And so you can see here, because I've got a Fender model with 2 controls, it's only got bass and treble, and they're both set to the middle. Now you can still set these to the EQ settings, so if you actually decide you want to do a lower gain profile and have the treble on 7 and the bass on 4. You can set that so it just gives it a reference of how you've set it. And of course it's going to be set on distorted if it's full gain profile, of course. And then you just start profiling as always, wait for the alien invasion to end, and then you do your refining, and when you're happy you save it. My 68 custom Fender Princeton reverb was still mic'd from a recent session, so I took advantage and made a profile of it. As with the Plexi style head, I made a generic profile with a lower gain. The amp was set with the volume on 4, bass on 3.5 and treble on 8. I then made a liquid profile selecting a deluxe normal as the amp model, as it should be quite similar to a Princeton, setting the amp on 10 and treble and bass on 5.5 as per Kemper's instructions, and I made a direct profile as well so we can test the merges. Once again, I needed to use the generic gain to match the liquid versions to the generic profile when turning it down. The gain levels were different between the direct and full profile too, which can be an issue with merged profiles due to the lower wattage speakers compressing and distorting and adding to the overall overdrive. So once again, this is the sound of the full volume liquid profile. And this is a generic crunch tone I made. This is a liquid profile with the gain matching a generic one and the EQ set the same. Now that doesn't sound exactly the same, so I'm going back to the generic one. What I notice here is the definition was up higher on the generic one, so if I turn that up, it certainly sounds closer. So that's worth noting, because we all know that when you profile at different levels, the definition that it chooses to select is often quite different. I then made a merge profile, matched that up, which sounds exactly the same as the liquid profile turned down the full profile. So once again, going back to the merge profile, if I turn up the definition, it sounds the same as the generic one. Once again, very close but not quite identical. I've added these 3 profiles, along with the ones from the Plexi style amp, onto Rig Exchange so you can try and compare them yourself. Look for Greg D. It occurred to me that a liquid profile of a 5V3 Tweed Deluxe style amp would be very revealing. The 5V3 circuit is a wild animal on 12. The sag from the rectifier tube is such that on full it actually drops in volume with the attack of the note. The Kemper doesn't have a model of the single tone control Tweed amps, so I selected the Tweed Bassman as at least the controls go to 12. With the models, the tone doesn't change if everything is in the middle, it's only when you make adjustments that they come into effect, which is why it isn't essential to have the exact model for your amp. The main tone character is still coming from the profile of your amp. The only exception to this, as mentioned before, is with a bright cap on some models, which will come into effect as you turn down the volume, which may or may not be what you want. So once again, here's the full volume liquid profile, amp on 12, and of course being Tweed, the tone control was on 6.5. So I actually like that better than the live amp, the real amp, because it doesn't have the same compression that, is over the top on a Tweed Deluxe. Then made a generic crunch profile with the volume on 2.5, tone still on 6.5. And here's that full profile turned down to the same gain setting. So once again, not exactly the same. Seems to be a bit harsher to me. Here's the amp with the generic setting of 7. And then the liquid profile turned down to the same setting. That seems to sound closer to me for that one. So not exactly the same, but actually probably prefer that slightly as a sound. And then last, I went with the generic clean sound. Volume down on 2. This is the full volume liquid profile clean, turned down. So once again, not 100% the same there, although quite close. It's definitely safe to say it sounds and responds more like a real amp now, but it's not exact. Now, being exact isn't necessarily essential. For me anyway, I'm looking for as good. It doesn't have to be, the exact model of the amp, as long as it's got the same sort of quality of sound. So I'm going to have to listen back to that and, work it out for myself. Now, the gain thing is going to be something to watch if you're trying to match exact tones. And Kemper mentioned the settings, not quite matching up depending on the amp. And I know I found that with pots, particularly. I discovered this in my video comparing the original Peanut Butter Overdrive to the Model T version. The output level was quite different with some of the same settings on a few of them. I discovered that pots have a tolerance of plus or minus 20%, which is a huge variable. So the more pots in the circuit, the less chance there is that two pieces of gear would sound exactly the same with the same settings dialed in. So to finish up, I thought it'd be fun just to, I've got a short loop here, and I'm going to go and flip through some of the models to hear how it changes the sound as it's, as you go through them. So that gives us an idea of the accuracy. It's not perfect, although it's definitely closer to being like a real amp. Now, one thing I don't say, which you can actually do, is still make your profiles at a lower or mid-gain, sort of settings, and you can even match up the EQ settings you had with the EQ in the Kemper. Like when you're profiling, if you go to those EQ controls and put in that it's on 7 and that one's on 6, whatever, when it makes the profile, it has that as the reference of where it's been set. And so if you get to the gig and you go, I wish it was a bit brighter or a bit less gain, it's still going to make the appropriate change, and it's going to be much closer to the real amp. So you don't actually have to make the profiles with it on 10 the whole time. And so I think that's going to be an advantage too, which hasn't really been explored or talked about. So as always, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you soon.